right, guys, ready? In 3, 2, 1.
Drivers, start your engines!
Let's go, Brandon!
This is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. We must increase vaccinations among the unvaccinated with new vaccination requirements.
It's not going to work. We have other countries with much higher rates of vaccination, and they're seeing record surges of COVID because that's what viruses do.
Many of us are frustrated with the nearly 80 million Americans who are still not vaccinated.
Their freedom. I want my freedom to live.
Rest in peace, Wheezy.
We are going to need the people to engage in age-old American tradition of simply saying, no, I'm not going to comply. Now, what are you going to do about it?
It never stops. They want things to get worse because they want you to suffer so that they can grandstand on your suffering and push for even more control.
They have criminalized freedom. They've made getting sick illegal.
This isn't about COVID any more than the Patriot Act was about Al-Qaeda. It's about government asserting more control over your lives, your rights, your properties, and in this case, your bodily autonomy.
It has a lot of vaccinated people alarmed because of the power grab that's involved.
Enough is enough. We better change our tune and start resisting.
Government makes up less than 1% of the population. If even 5 or 10% of Americans simply refuse to comply, all of this goes away.
Absolutely, this is the hill worth dying on.
We haven't given the statutory authority to any agency to do this kind of thing.
There is no such thing as government power. There's only what we are willing to comply to.
We're in the tough stretch, and it could last for a while.
That's what this has always been about. It's never about what they say it is. It's about controlling you. And it ends when we decide to end it.
This BS is going to stop.
It's time for us to
There's
wake
only
up.
one way to fight back against this, and it's mass non-compliance.
This is the most important thing to fight against.
You can help stop this. You are the power.
There's nothing, not a single thing we're unable to do if we do it together.
And I'm fucking livid that we are stuck in the timeline where Alex Jones is right. Kind of worse than it was.
Oh no! Oh, okay, no.
Why aren't the Amish afraid of COVID? Because they don't have TVs.
As I said, democracy is a system that reinforces authoritarian ideals.
I hope I don't get canceled. Talk to Steve.
Being a victim of a tragedy doesn't make you an expert in public policy.
Well, I mean, AOC is a drama queen and she's full of shit.
Remember, they lost the Afghan war 10 years ago.
You brought a freaking guillotine.
I did. They said, you don't get to tell us no. We're the state health department. And I said, hell no.
It wasn't making Christianity better. It was making rock worse.
What the fuck do you have on your face, Olivia?
You want to make the world a better place? Have some babies and raise them to not be stupid.
I remember thinking, man, governments are not going to like this shit.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, activists, and people of the internet, thank you for tuning in to another episode of O'Donnell for Liberty. As always, I'm your host, Justin. Before we get started, just remember whatever platform you listen on, whether YouTube Live, Odyssey, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, or on the air at lrn.fm, you can help grow the show by liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing with your friends. If you enjoy the content, you can join our production team by visiting patreon.com/O'Donnell for Liberty. Again, that's patreon.com/O'Donnell, the number 4, Liberty. If you want to keep in touch between shows, follow me on social media, join our community Discord channel where you can chat with other fans about the show at any time. All these links can be found in the description of the video or podcast that you're listening to, as well as on o'donnellforliberty.com. So check out the link in the description to give that a visit today. First and foremost, a shout out to sneckswag.com, where you can get all your favorite Liberty merch, including some awesome new hoodies to celebrate your heritage of rebellion and treason in the collection, just in time for colder weather to start creeping in. So make sure you remember to head over to sneckswag.com to pick up your merch today. Today, we're talking about the coercion of the military hierarchy and the forgotten promise of America's soldiers. Semper Fidelis, it means always faithful. It's the core of a promise that a Marine makes to their country. What they never told the Marine was that that promise only goes one way. Many young men and women have signed the blank check worth their lives to Uncle Sam, with the promise to always be faithful and always be true in the defense of this nation its people, and its principles. And many thousands of times, the United States government has cashed those checks in full, relying on these young boys and girls being so willing to go into harm's way to do what needs to be done into the service of their nation. And through the years, we've seen ample evidence that the government disregards the service and trauma of these young veterans and casts them aside in its push for authoritarian hegemony. Since 2001, the United States has engaged in a new type of war, a constant war, a TV war, a war where the consequences are felt by our society rather than our government. With every tragedy broadcast on a 24/7 news cycle and the propaganda machine working full-time to celebrate the deeds of those brave young men and women deployed to fight the conflict chosen by the elite, the consequences and perils of this generational conflict have gone largely ignored by those in power to correct them. PTSD has become rampant and is largely left untreated and undiagnosed. Veterans make up one of the largest demographics of America's homeless population. The leading cause of death amongst post-9/11 veterans is suicide. The Department of Veterans Affairs has become politicized and wrapped up in one scandal after another, all while the availability and quality of medical and mental health care for our veterans has been reduced to the bare minimum. Many of you watching or listening have become passingly familiar with my own story and my own history. How in 2008, as a 19-year-old with no idea what I was doing in life, I also signed that check to Uncle Sam. How 5 years later, I participated in the military occupation and lockdown of the city of Boston during an unlawful and undeclared state of martial law. How later that year, a protester delivered me a message that was so compelling that in the midst of carrying out my orders, for the first time in my life, I began to question not just their legality, but also their morality and the righteousness of the mission and the consequences of partaking in the war that I had lost so many friends to. Over the past 7 years, I've watched from the outside as the United States continued to fight a seemingly endless war. As young men and women survived the battlefield only to fall to depression and addiction at home. I found it too difficult to keep in touch with many of those I'd served with because of constantly having to watch from afar as they suffer and lost along the way. But now, in more recent times, we've seen a new threat to the principles of our great nation, and a threat to the very autonomy of the individual to make personal medical decisions without the insistence of government force along the way. And as many of us could have predicted, as many of us saw coming with the writing on the wall, the first test subjects for these mandates, these unlawful orders, these dictates from on high, and these experimental medical treatments would be those men and women who believe so strongly in the values of this nation that they were willing to write that check to the government to defend them. Semper Fidelis, always faithful, an unmatched promise that goes down in history as being one of the most dangerous lies ever told. But then again, if the United States was known for keeping its promises, maybe we wouldn't need the military so much. We're going to take some questions, so make sure you hit the like button, you leave some comments, and tell us what you think in chat. And give a welcome to tonight's guest, someone currently serving in the United States military, someone who wrote that check, and someone who stood on their principles against the coercive orders of the ruling elite, and someone who's potentially going to pay the price for it. Soldier, thank you so much for joining this program tonight. And again, at great risk to yourself, at great risk to your career, you've decided that you want to speak up about what is going on in the military today with these vaccine mandates. And I just want to applaud you, and I know my audience wants to applaud you, for having the goddamn balls to actually stand up and say something about what you're going through. And I think really the first thing I'd want to hear is maybe, as much as we can, without giving too much away, a little bit of your backstory, a little bit about what possessed you to join the military in the first place.
Sure. Thank you for having me on the show, Justin. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to get this out of the way. My views are not those of the United States government, Department of Defense, or U.S. Army. Hopefully that should save me if staying anonymous does not.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. I've been in the military for quite some time, 5 years. I guess I joined out of a sense of duty. kind of felt it was right that I could serve, so I should serve my community, especially in the National Guard. National Guard does a lot of community efforts, natural disaster cleanup, and helping people along the way when stuff like that happens.
No, and to me, that's one of the more commendable missions of the United States military and the National Guard. And it's a weird, conflicted point of view for me as a libertarian and formerly as a constitutionalist to take, where I recognize the very need to not have a standing army, the very reason that the founders of this nation were so opposed to having a standing army, but again, seeing the great benefit that the National Guard has provided in times of true emergency. I served in the Massachusetts National Guard for years in blizzard response, hurricane response, and dealing with actual natural disasters where the National Guard was the only entity able to help in those critical times. And it's always been a conflict of me to look back on things like that and say, if that was all we did and that was all the National Guard was for, I never would have left.
Yeah, exactly. And especially the last year and a half with all the COVID missions, pretty much National Guard has been the #1 resource across the country for assisting with the pandemic. Whether or not you agree with it, got a lot of questions asked. Did you ever think that you'd be doing all this pandemic work in the National Guard? And I said, yeah, that's kind of what I signed up for.
Right. Yeah, and that is what you signed up for. And I think that's what a lot of people don't realize is I signed up to join an emergency response force. I signed up as an infantryman. And I knew going into my career as an infantryman that there was a risk of deployment in total war. That I signed up post 9/11. I knew we were at war. But I also knew that joining the National Guard meant that it was a prioritized mission on the home front to help people at home. And that is an incredibly important mission. And this is one of the most valuable components of the National Guard and the military as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got plenty of people who are always waiting for the next deployment, but I'm not. I want to stay here, and I want to make sure that, next snowstorm or potential hurricane that makes its way up here, that we can help out.
So in the past year, you said, and I mean, it's been obvious, National Guard has been so heavily involved in COVID response and pandemic response in the past year and a half, 2 years. We now see it to the point where in Massachusetts, they're activating National Guard soldiers to drive school buses. They're activating National Guard troops to replace nurses in hospitals in Connecticut and New York. What kind of missions were you what was the general mission during the past year and a half that the National Guard stepped up to cover that wasn't coverable any other way?
Last year and a half did a whole range of missions, anywhere from test sites to warehouse distribution, working at vaccine sites, and strangely enough, a lot of people just got activated to do their job as maintenance workers because we were using all of our vehicles pretty much every single day as opposed to once a month. So we had a lot of vehicle issues that we needed to take care of. So did a lot of maintenance work too.
It's astounding when people think about the readiness of the National Guard, and it's almost a joke. And I tell people all the time, when I talk to people who are preppers or anti-government people who are training with little militias, and people are like, oh, if the military activates, people are screwed. I'm like, I don't know. Have you ever seen the inside of a National Guard armory? Have you ever seen how often they actually train with weapons? Have you ever seen the status of their vehicles? All you need to steal a Humvee is a set of bolt cutters. And I'm not sure it's worth it because you might make it 20 miles before you blow a head gasket or have an oil leak.
That's very true. We're working on that every day. And we're probably going to continue working on that every day.
All right. Now, in the meantime, you've been doing your job. You've been carrying out your orders. You've been helping people. You've been working diligently to fulfill the role that you enlisted for and you signed up for in line with your principles and your values. And then all of a sudden, something happened. What happened? The vaccine mandate's coming down, and we all saw the writing on the wall. I said very early on that the first step was going to be the military. They were going to force the military to get vaccinated as a test subject to prove it was safe, and other people were saying the same. But how long ago was it that you in the military first heard wind that it was going to be a required vaccine for COVID-19?
Well, I don't know if you ever remembered towards the beginning of this year, the word on the street was the vaccine will never be mandated for service members, regardless if it was emergency use or FDA approved. They weren't going to do it. That was the lie that they had told us at the beginning of this year.
Right. Well, even the beginning of this year, Joe Biden said they would never support any vaccine mandate. The choice was very important, and we've seen how that panned out with the Biden administration.
Yeah. But probably late June, July, or early July, that was when the DOD said that as soon as it becomes FDA approved, then they'll start mandating it for service members.
And they've done that. And so they've put in the mandate, and like what's been the process? Because the National Guard, you're not on site every day. You're not active duty. It's not something where you go to your morning formation and you're drilled every single day by your first sergeant and company staff about who's vaccinated, who's not. Go get your vaccination. Okay, you go to sick call. Like, how have they been communicating it to you in the National Guard, the part-time soldiers who aren't there every day?
Not very well. Pretty much first that we heard about this was from a text from our leadership. Got sent down to platoon level and then section level. So it was a text, and that was beginning September, end of September.
So just barely a month ago.
Yeah, pretty short notice with everything. Like I said, no one really expected this to actually become mandated, and they're moving pretty fast with it.
Yeah, and it is surprising how fast the military can move on something when they are motivated. It's just curious to see that these are the motivations. What kind of initial reception would you say it had amongst soldiers you knew, being told that they were going to be mandated to get the vaccine?
At least from soldiers close to me, anyone who hadn't got it was pretty furious, and everyone that had got it was also furious because most of the soldiers that I work with, are against the mandate. They don't think that this should be mandated to anybody. It's probably the most controversial medical medical procedure that you can get in modern times. So no one really wants us to be forced to get it.
I mean, it's wild to think that vaccination is the most controversial medical procedure to get in these times where we're still debating abortion bans in half the country. As to all of a sudden the vaccine is more controversial to them. And especially, I mean, I'm going to play a little bit of a devil's advocate here. Given the fact that if your enlistment process was anything like mine, I still to this day don't know what vaccines I received. But I remember standing in line at Fort Benning. I remember standing in line at Edwards before deployment. I remember standing in line at Camp Ethan Allen. I remember standing in line at Fort Devens year over year for annual vaccinations that were just told, you're getting them. Here they are. Here's your shot. And for years, there was never any pushback to that in the military when I was in the military. It wasn't anything I ever thought of until this recent issue with the COVID vaccines.
Oh yeah, definitely. I remember enlistment, going to basic training when you're going through the whole in-process thing. Everyone is in a line. You step forward, get a jab in one arm, step forward, get in the other arm, step forward, get in the other arm again.
Right.
Keep going back and forth. But I would probably say anthrax would probably be something on a much smaller scale.
Right. And the anthrax vaccine we knew was, we knew when it was being given. And anybody who got the anthrax vaccine was very aware that they were getting the anthrax vaccine. Also very aware that it was experimental. But I feel like it was a lot more accepted and there was less pushback to that at the time because of the way it was presented to us. It was presented as you're getting vaccinated and inoculated to anthrax, which is a weapon that an enemy of this country is using to target troops like yourself and government employees like yourself. Not you're getting a vaccine, an experimental vaccine to this virus that everybody is exposed to. That's a global pandemic, not an American pandemic, and is it really is different, and the way everything's been proposed is the speed at which it was issued and approved, and the unclear nature of the research behind it, and how it's very difficult to get information about its efficacy, and even how the government has changed its tune on its efficacy so much over the past year.
Yeah, absolutely. And the force and coercion surrounding this COVID-19 vaccine is unprecedented. Never seen before. Never had any kind of medical procedure being pushed on me by every single facet of technology and social life.
Right, and that's the crazy part is it's not even government force at this point. It's there's a component of government force to it. There's a component of government coercion to it, but it's largely social and economic pressure that's forcing people to consider the vaccine. And that's wild because it's something I never would have considered as being a threat to individual sovereignty and individual freedom of medical choices. Social pressure compelling the government to act.
I think it's kind of back and forth between the two.
Right,
I think government initially pressured, and then now there's some public pressure back on government to keep going with it.
So speaking of the coercion, speaking of the coercion of the hierarchy, because the military is a hierarchical system, orders come from the top, people at the bottom follow the orders. What are the consequences for disobeying this order? Like, what are the consequences for a soldier saying, no, I'm not giving informed consent to taking this vaccine?
So as of right now, there are no consequences, and we'll go into that in a little bit. But there are threats for sure. These are empty threats. They have no ground currently, but they are threats.
And what kind of threats have they been throwing at you?
Well, going back to that text that we first received, we got a text, October drill, everyone will be receiving the vaccine, be receiving Pfizer. If you deny the vaccine, you will be sent home and will receive an other than honorable discharge within 5 days.
And that's a big deal. For anybody watching or listening who's like unfamiliar, like getting an other than honorable discharge, I mean, it's not as bad as a dishonorable or a bad conduct discharge or even a mental health chapter, but it's a stain on your record that you have to explain for the rest of your life. In any setting, any job you apply for is going to ask if you were discharged from the military other than honorably, and you have to explain what happened.
Yeah, and I mean, I knew that was a empty threat the minute I saw that. I mean, the process to receive an OTH takes a lot longer than 5 days, and you need to have a pattern of insubordination, not just one time.
Right. So the empty threat there, and obviously it's coming past that time period. Has anybody seen I mean, what happened when was that bluff called? And when people called that bluff, how did your chain of command react, or how did the National Guard react?
Well, empty threat as it might be for some of us more experienced soldiers, for a lot of the younger soldiers, obviously they didn't really know the process. They were obviously intimidated by it. I remember we had about 20 soldiers together, all ready to fight this thing together, and then got that text, and then we also received an email which included the OTH threat and also receiving a GOMAR, General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand, which pretty much puts your whole military career on hold. You're not going to get promoted or get any awards or anything like that once you have a GOMAR initiated.
Right. And we've seen a lot in other forms of media of people who have been like caving to the pressure, caving to the threats. On TikTok, especially, I know TikTok is just Vine with a new skin, and I say long live Vine. But it's become really the new wave of like pop culture, social media, and the short form videos that people are putting out on TikTok. And a couple weeks ago, there was one that went really viral. And then if you dug in, there was hundreds just like it, where were people active duty military were recording themselves getting their vaccine while holding a sign saying, I am doing this under duress, not by choice. I do not consent, but I'm unwilling to lose my livelihood and put my family's health at stake because of it.
Oh yeah, I've seen those TikToks. It's pretty messed up. It's pretty messed up that they're giving us these threats. Either get this or, yeah, your livelihoods are at stake. And part of the well, this wasn't really a threat. This actually did happen. For all the leadership positions, such as commanders, sergeant majors, first sergeants, platoon leaders, and platoon sergeants. If you did deny it, then you would be removed from your position within 5 days. And that has happened to a number of commanders and first sergeant throughout the National Guard.
It's absolutely wild to me. And I think this is such an incredibly dangerous precedent because while you're removing people in a position of leadership, you're removing people, even if you're only targeting people in a position of leadership, the people that you're targeting are those who have shown that they're willing to question orders, they're willing to reason and rationally think about the orders that they're given, and they're not willing to blindly accept orders. Whether or not they are pro-vaccine or whether or not it's a leader who says, no, I'm not going to force my soldiers to get vaccinated, being removed, all of a sudden, what you're left with is people throughout the middle ranks of the chain of command, first sergeants, commanders, who are issuing those orders to lower level troops, and you're left with a blindly complying military. You're left with an armed force that will blindly comply with the orders that they're given from an authoritarian state.
Exactly. They're purging any of the disobedient leadership, and any of the ones that decide to comply, well, now they're in the machine of complying.
And that's just, it's aggravating to me. I mean, as I look back on things, it was, I got counseled quite a bit near the end of my career. And I've told the story a number of times. My viewers are very familiar with my story about how I came to my realization that I wasn't fit for the military, and I no longer believed in the military's mission and what we were doing because of unlawful orders I was being given and expected to carry out. When I started to get political, I never did it in uniform. I always distanced myself. I never did it at drill. I never preached politics at drill. I never did it on mission. It was Facebook and Twitter and social media, and I started getting involved in politics and helping with campaigns, and sharing information from people like Julie Borowski and Rand Paul. Rand Paul was a sitting U.S. senator at the time I was sharing all this information, and I got counseled by my platoon sergeant at the time for engaging in I'm trying to remember the wording. It was detrimental political activity. Saying that my conduct was detrimental to the unit and to the National Guard. And it was at that moment, I'd already made the decision. I'm not re-enlisting. So I'm like, yep, right, whatever the hell you want, Staff Sergeant, I'll sign it right now. But it's mind-blowing. If I look back on how willing the military has been to crush dissent within its ranks, this shouldn't seem surprising, but it still is.
Well, those same gag orders talking about politics are now being applied to the vaccine. You start talking about anything about the vaccine, and it's overheard by someone who doesn't want to hear it. They will counsel you, and they will give you an order that you will not talk about the vaccine any longer while in uniform.
Well, while in uniform is one thing, and I do get that. And there is a long history of, and there's a very good reason why the rules exist that prohibit service members from getting involved politically while in uniform and while representing the military. Because the military is supposed to be an apolitical entity. It is supposed to answer to civilian politicians. It is not supposed to be involved in their selection. And it's a very, very important line to draw. Once the military starts getting openly and actively political, It's a very short leap to the military engaging in a coup and choosing who the leader is. So I understand why the military doesn't want people doing anything political in uniform. But the moment you step out of uniform, you're on your private social media, you're talking with your friends and your family. Once the military starts policing your conduct and your speech in that area is where I start to realize that it's going above and beyond what it's authorized to do. It is going above and beyond to crush dissent within its ranks rather than to promote thought in critical thinking in reason and rational thinking skills within its soldiers.
Right, absolutely. And, the military censoring vaccine talk on the basis of political speech is just yielding the point that the vaccine is political and not about public health.
And to that point, you had sent me a video. I have not watched it yet. I wanted to go into this blind of some of the propaganda that they'd showed you.
Before you do that, do you want to just me to recap up to that point of
get up to that point, get up to that point of the process of when they tried to convince you with propaganda and political propaganda to get the vaccine.
Yeah, so at a recent drill, so we had 20 soldiers looking to fight this thing, and with the text they sent out and the emails, we got down to 6. And so, of course, we were counseled for that. And it wasn't negative counseling, just developmental counseling. And basically, the counseling is ordering us. It says you're hereby ordered to become fully vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine. And then there's steps towards denial. Step 1 would be to watch this video. Step 2 would be to meet with chaplain if you're seeking religious exemptions, or speak with the medical provider if you're seeking medical exemptions. The next step would be to meet with the medical provider, and if you're still refusing it, then that's when they're going to initiate flags and GOMARs and all sorts of stuff like that. And so we went through this counseling, and then we went out to go do we had a 4-day drill. We went out to go do our thing, and the second night, pretty much all the bad eggs, us bad people, us bad boys, they pulled us out right after dinner chow, so about 6-7 o'clock, and they took us to a different location where they had us watch this video.
All right, so this video, again, for those watching along, I have not seen it yet either. I am fascinated to see what kind of propaganda the U.S. Army thought would convince people to get the vaccine.
First came the virus that had never been seen before, and that spread faster than we could ever imagine. Now we hear there's a safe and effective way to stop it. Vaccines that will protect millions from COVID-19. But can we really know they're safe after less than a year of testing? COVID-19 vaccines may be new, but vaccines are not. We've been using vaccines to protect against infectious diseases for over a century. 2 COVID vaccines are the first authorized vaccines ever to use a new technology, but even that technology, called messenger RNA, has...
I'm going to stop it right there. Vaccines have been around forever. We know vaccines are safe. These 2 vaccines are using a new technology. That is one of the biggest red flags I've ever seen in a safety propaganda.
It's been tested and studied by vaccine researchers for decades. We've learned how to make vaccines better and safer, and we've applied all that knowledge to COVID-19 vaccines. We also had a head start on COVID vaccines thanks to studies the National Institutes of Health had done. Scientists there actually created a vaccine that could be custom-made to fight different strains of coronavirus, like the virus that causes COVID. Using these studies, they were able to make a COVID-19 test vaccine just over a month after the disease was first reported. All vaccines have to be thoroughly tested before they can be marketed. During clinical trials, scientists measure and compare data on volunteers who receive a vaccine to those who receive a placebo, like an injection of saline. Most early clinical trials involve fewer than 3,000 volunteers, so it can take a year or more to get the data needed to measure how well vaccines work. Early clinical trials for COVID vaccines enrolled at least 30,000 volunteers each, so data on safety and performance were collected and analyzed in under 4 months. Vaccines are usually developed one step at a time, and companies wait until they have final approval to start manufacturing them. But addressing this pandemic couldn't wait. So government and industry invested millions of dollars to produce vaccines at the same time their test data was under review. This meant health departments and clinics started getting vaccine shipments a few days after the Food and Drug Administration's rigorous standards for safety were met, and the vaccines were authorized for public use. Thanks to extraordinary advances, science, industry, and dozens of government agencies have been able to work together to produce and deliver safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines in record time. Decades of experience and innovation led to this achievement, one that can keep you, your family, and your community safe from a serious and dangerous disease. Learn more, cdc.gov/coronavirus. We can do this.
That wasn't enough to convince you? I'm shocked.
Yeah, total insult to my intelligence and everyone else.
Like, it's kind of, I mean, it's strange because what they described there was the hypothetical of going through an actual clinical trial process, just fast-tracked because you got enough participants to do a large-scale clinical trial and get the ethical data in a single run instead of 3 or 4 runs over time. If that was the case, they would have just been given FDA approval for their clinical trial. It wouldn't have been an emergency use authorization. And like the very notion that it was an emergency use authorization is the government admitting that they didn't have the time to conduct thorough trials, that they were running with it anyways.
Yeah, the whole video was bogus. I mean, there was no information, there was no studies, any numbers shown. I think the only numbers that were in there were the number of months. That's it.
And like, and to your point, like the vaccine is not actually FDA approved. It has an emergency use authorization and an FDA authorization for the booster shots. It's not an FDA approval, it's a continued authorization until they finish clinical trials and the full FDA approval process. So there's misinformation in that video that's easily debunked using the CDC and the FDA's own resources. What happened after you saw that video? Like, did you bring up your concerns about the content of the video?
Absolutely. We all said, where's the information? Going back on your point, talking about the FDA, I mean, yeah, there are 2 different vaccines, and I probably should have sent it to you, but I'm sure anyone can pull it up if you look at the FDA letter of approval to Pfizer. It specifically says the emergency use authorized Pfizer BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine is legally distinct from the Pfizer BioNTech Comirnaty vaccine. They are 2 different entities. One has emergency use authorization, one is FDA approved. And the Comirnaty, you can look it up on the FDA white pages. Look at all the NDCs available for it. It doesn't exist in the United States.
And so there's an FDA approved vaccine and there's an FDA emergency authorized vaccine. There are 2 different vaccines. And I'm out of date on my information because I've been out of the military for long enough that I stopped caring and stopped paying attention. And I was in the military when we were getting experimental vaccines. They're no longer authorized to give experimental vaccines without full FDA approval to the military. Is that correct?
That is correct. All immunizations need to be fully FDA approved. That's why, while it was EUA, we couldn't be mandated it. So we were protected for a while it was still under emergency use. And now, since they've gotten FDA approval on the Comirnaty, they're attempting to fast track the vaccine mandate through the military.
And so, like even under the current rules, they are allowed to mandate the Comirnaty vaccine because it is FDA approved. The way their own rules are written, principles aside, personal politics aside, like according to the way the rules are written, that is allowable for them. That's not what they're doing, though, is it? Because I know a lot of soldiers on TikTok have been posting videos where they're swapping out the fact sheets in the vaccine cases and lying about what vaccine is being distributed.
Oh yeah, I mean, if we want to keep going through my wonderful experience at True,
go ahead.
So we watched this video, and then of course, Commander comes out and again begins threatening. Once again, if you refuse this, some of the consequences that might be are repayment of tuition assistance that you might have used to the military and repayment of your bonuses because you're not fulfilling your contract by denying the vaccine. So again, coming out of this with some more threats, and they're like, well, this is not a threat, as they threaten us with giving us GOMARs and other than honorables and trying to make us pay tuition and bonuses back. So following that, we met with the chaplain and the medical provider. Talking to the medical provider, I had everything printed out that you could possibly need. The FDA letter of approval to Pfizer, stating that the EUA and the FDA are two legally distinct. According to the medical provider, he had no idea about that, which is concerning as the medical professional for us, that he did not know that there were two different vaccines.
Hey, well, there's an old joke we used to have when I was stationed at Fort Benning in Georgia, and we had to deal with Martin Army Community Hospital for our sick call and everything. Is what do you call a doctor who graduates the last in his class at medical school? Colonel. So
yeah.
It doesn't, as concerning as it is, I don't find it surprising.
Yeah. So talking to the medical provider and pretty much following our conversation, I asked them, I said, if the Comirnaty vaccine is not available, will you be transparent with soldiers that you're vaccinating tomorrow and let them know that it's not the FDA approved, it's the emergency use? Of course, my response was, well, I don't think it really matters. I'm not going to do that. It seems irrelevant to me. Which I said, with all due respect, sir, I disagree with you. I think transparency is important. If they're not the Comirnaty vaccine, will you be transparent with soldiers? And then he replied, if they want to know more about it, they can just look at the fact sheet we've provided. And then going into the vaccine day, the fact sheet did say Comirnaty on there, but taking a look at the vials, they said Pfizer BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine. So they were the emergency use authorized vials using the FDA approved fact sheets. So that's deliberately lying to soldiers.
Yeah. So at some point, somebody in the military supply chain made a deliberate choice to swap out the fact sheets in those cases between the unapproved vaccine and the approved vaccine, because the unapproved one was already paid for and purchased.
Right. That's all we have in the United States is the EUA vaccine. The Comirnaty isn't even here. You can look it up. All the NDCs are not available in the United States. I think they might be available in Europe, but not here in the United States, not yet. So yeah, it was deliberately lying and trying to pull a fast one on some of these service members. Really insulting, and even more insulting that they're using this as a reason to try and get us kicked out or punish us.
So Robert Daniel did point out in chat, coming back to one of my earlier points, like those who comply are therefore also more likely to get promoted and fill the vacuum left by those that are dismissed. Yes, that's absolutely the point. Anybody who doesn't comply, anybody who questions orders, anybody who thinks rationally about this and wants to make an informed decision with informed consent is going to be drummed the hell out at some point, and they're going to be replaced by people who blindly question orders. And that, to me, is the most terrifying part of all of this. But I mean, after you dealt with a medical provider, after even pointing out the fact sheets are wrong, even pointing out that you're being lied to about what's being provided, what was your next step to try and, like, how did you go about getting a religious exemption if you can't get a medical one?
Well, so speaking with the chaplain before, and so the process was supposed to be that you write up your memo, then you go see the chaplain, then you answer some questions. They have a whole entire questionnaire. A lot of it's trying to catch you and your beliefs, see if they're conflicting. Like, if you're a Roman Catholic, the chaplain might say, well, the Pope says that it's okay to get the vaccine, that type of thing. So you go through that questionnaire with the chaplain, you hand them your memo. That's supposed to be the process. And then all these religious exemptions, they're all supposed to be filed all the way up to the Surgeon General of the Army. So one person has to approve or deny all these religious exemptions. So that could, what we were told is it could take up to 6 months to 1 year to receive either an approval or a denial. So we had a lot of soldiers who, were worried about getting this thing, and they didn't have any religious reasons to deny it. But
in the meantime, while they're taking 6 months to a year to review your religious exemption, that's 6 months to a year that you're under flag, where you can't be promoted, you can't go to school, you can't get additional training, you're non-deployable. It's a 6 month to a year just halt on your career.
No, actually.
No? Okay.
No. So once you begin the exemption process, you're protected from any sort of probationary measures, any kind of punitive action. You're protected from that while you're seeking an exemption. So that's why it was encouraged to any soldier, even if they weren't have any religious exemptions, to still go through with it, because that's giving you 6 months to a year time to figure something else out.
Yeah, I mean, if it were me, I'd be the principled asshole that would apply as an atheist for a religious exemption and list my religion as atheism. I heard a story from an air traffic controller in my family where the Air Traffic Control Commission is approving every religious exemption on the spot, because they're so short-staffed and so desperate for staff as air traffic controllers. They're not willing to risk losing staff to vaccine mandates. And he saw somebody fill out their air traffic control vaccine religious exemption form, and under where he had to list his church, he put the union local, and he just listed his union was his religion, and they approved it.
Yeah, I actually use the non-aggression principle for my religious exemption.
So that's a fascinating argument, and I kind of want to hear you break it down.
Sure. Pretty much, I got both the medical provider and the chaplain to both admit that the vaccine is used in a forceful and coercive way, the vaccine mandate. So they both admit it. No one's denying that it's not forceful or coercive the way that they're implementing this. And of course, the non-aggression principle is the intimidation and initiation of force or coercion against people or their property is inherently wrong. So I pretty much just use that. Some of the questions were, would you get this vaccine if it was beneficial to others or the good of society? And of course, my reply was, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
It really, so many great things are done by horrible people, and so many horrible things are done by great people with the best of intentions. And that's something that people just don't seem to grasp, that like a lot of the issues in the world today are due to the American government thinking they're doing the good thing. And if it weren't for American interventionism, American foreign militarism, and American nation building, and like the attitude of being a superpower in charge of policing the rest of the world, we could very well have world peace today. And that's all been done with the best of intentions. And once you recognize that, it's very, very easy to realize the principles of best intentions do not equal equitable and safe outcomes.
Exactly. And yeah, so there are a lot of questions like that. Trying to catch you off guard or something like that. I just stuck to my principles. I disagree with the force and coercion aspect of the mandate. And that's what I stuck with. And actually, the chaplain said that I articulated my case very well, and that I mean, I don't know whether or not they are approving or denying any of these exemptions, these religious exemptions, but he said if he was in charge, he would probably give it an approval.
Well, and that's the crazy part. If they really are funneling everything up to the Surgeon General, didn't we just get a new Surgeon General, or is it the Surgeon General of the Army or the Surgeon General of Health, the Department of Health and Human Services, Uniformed Services? Because
Surgeon General of the Army.
Okay, because there is another level above the Surgeon General of the Army, and we just got a new one of those, and she is hyper political, and she gave a big speech about the importance of mandates and denying exemptions to mandates yesterday. But even if they're only all going up to the Surgeon General of the Army, I'd imagine if the military is anything representative of the general population, and we're looking at 40%, about 41% of the general population has refused to get vaccinated to this point, that's hundreds of thousands of troops that are going to be looking for exemptions down the road. And now you're going to see a lot of the ones in higher rank with families who are going to cave to the pressure and not be willing to risk their careers because they're trying to provide for a family, who are going to comply and cave to it. But you're going to see a lot of younger ones who say, fuck you, I'll stick it to the man. No, I'm not getting it. I'll file my exemption. That's still going to be tens of thousands, if not 100,000 applications to get to the Surgeon General over time. I can't imagine it's anything more than a blanket exception or denial of all of them, because there's no way the Surgeon General's office can manually review every single one of them.
Right. But that's exactly what the process is. The Surgeon General has to manually review every single one. And that's why I'm not sure if any of them are going to get approved, because if one gets approved, then that sets the precedent for others that are like it. So it could be a very long, drawn-out process that could give a lot of soldiers a lot of time to find different ways to get around this. I know I had one soldier who was using AR-40-562 Appendix C, which is talking about vaccinations and immunizations and natural immunity. So in that Army regulation, if you have natural immunity, then you're exempt from receiving immunizations. Of course, the argument that the leadership will say is that AR doesn't apply to COVID because it was written before COVID. If we applied that same thing to every other Army regulation, then what are we even doing? So it's insane, but there are other ways to fight this than just religious. And I mean, if the medical provider doesn't want to approve it, then you can always try to get an appeal to that denial from the medical provider. So then you'd have to go through, get a JAG or a lawyer or something like that. So you could really draw this out if you want to. I know for sure that if my religious gets denied, then I'll move on to that next part and drag this out even longer. I guess really the best way to fight this is to drown them out in paperwork.
Well, I mean, one of the things that really stuck out to me is you'd said only 6 guys in your unit have remained unvaccinated. I don't know how big your unit is. I don't know how many guys, what your structure is. I know I was in a very small unit. When I was in the military, I was in a heavy weapons company and infantry battalion. My platoon was 24 people, a very undersized unit as far as military units go. But 6 guys in an entire company is a very, very small percentage. And you would think that the military is reflective of the population as a whole. And you would think that if 41% of Americans are refusing to get vaccinated, then it should be closer to 41% of the military population is also refusing to get vaccinated. And it makes me wonder what the difference there is. And is this coercion effective? As we're seeing when people on TikTok and soldiers going out of their way to post on social media about how they're getting it under duress and they don't want it and they don't believe in it and they're being forced to get it. Or is it successful propaganda, or is there another explanation?
Well, I got a small unit, approximately 40 soldiers. So there could be other units. I've heard of other units where non-compliance is somewhere in the 60% range, as opposed to, I think we're like 8 or 9% non-compliant. So there's definitely other units throughout the country that are out there. I think a lot of soldiers in the National Guard had close proximity to those CDC cards when we work in vaccine sites.
I wasn't going to outright say that.
That's all I'll say about that.
I wasn't going to outright say that. I do know I was in possession at a point in time of a stack of CDC vaccination cards that were handed to me by a National Guard soldier who didn't believe in the mandates or the vaccine and was distributing them freely because they were in close proximity to a whole bunch of them. And at the time, I thought, that's fascinating. That's amazing. That's awesome. You're doing a great service for people. In hindsight, I look back on it, and as someone who I recently lost a job, I lost one of my major contracts because I'm not vaccinated. And like I posted about it on Twitter and was engaging in discussion with people. And I got a message from somebody saying, hey, you should consider getting one of these fake cards, or you should consider getting a fake vaccine from, I know of some pharmacies that'll let you fill out the paperwork and won't inject you and still give you the card because they get paid. And I thought about it and responded to him like, you know what? No, because I don't want to normalize compliance, because what you're doing here is you're normalizing compliance with your non-compliant rebellion. If you're going to get a fake card or a fake vaccine, you're saying to yourself, I'm against this vaccine, I'm against these mandates, I'm against this government tyranny, but you're saying to everyone else that compliance is okay, that we should do this, and you're giving the government a data point to confirm that people are okay with getting vaccinated and okay with the mandates to continue on with their life. And so I've gone the route of refusing to take one of those cards and refusing to fill it out to use it because of that. But it wouldn't surprise me if a big number of the military is using a fake card, and I wonder what they're going to do when booster shots become a thing.
Right. Yeah. My whole reasoning for not going the CDC card route was the more people that comply with this, the longer it's going to go and the harsher it's going to get. So I want to take that stand, make that fight, hopefully win, maybe. And if we do win, we can set the precedent that other people don't need to get this. So when the boosters do come around, you already have had this fight, and now they know what to do moving forward once those roll around.
Yeah, I am going to bring up a couple comments in chat here and see what, because people have been having a lot to say. Hold on, going back here. The Salt Lakers in chat on YouTube has been bringing up a lot of examples of news stories about the United States military conducting illegal experiments on troops and civilians using vaccines in the past. Robert Daniel asks, what does the general public need to do to back our service members and get this mandatory vaccine policy reversed? Unfortunately, as someone who's worked in politics for so long, I'm not sure there's anything the general public can do other than what the anti-vaccine mandate crowd is already doing, working with legislators and working with policymakers to get things reversed through the election process and through the legislative process. But other than that, this is a federal mandate, and the federal politics is in the hands of the elite and the wealthy, not Americans. In your mind, is there any way you could see the military taking feedback from the general public to stop a policy?
I don't believe the military would take that. But I mean, you can look at states like Florida, DeSantis. I mean, he is acting as the commander in chief for his National Guard, and he is not allowing any of these mandates to move through the Florida National Guard. So I guess at least I know my governor doesn't care about any of this stuff, and
Most governors don't.
He's definitely going to mandate this for us. But I guess the best thing the general public could do is to vote out the politicians that are coercing and forcing this on soldiers and on their citizens.
Yeah. Robert also had in chat, on the subject of protecting others, getting a vaccine only protects the individual who gets it. It does not prevent one from getting the virus and being contagious. How does the Army answer that?
The Army doesn't answer that. A lot of questions or questions I was asked by the medical provider and by the chaplain was, would you get this to protect others? I had that question asked to me multiple times. Of course, I said, show me the study that says that I can't get or transmit with the vaccine. Of course, there is no study. Medical provider can't provide that because it doesn't exist. You can absolutely get and transmit COVID-19 with the vaccine.
Yeah, and of course, the Salt Lakers also comes back with, I just lost a comment. I'm terrible at managing chat, guys. I'm sorry. The only immunity involved with the vax is that of any and all liability for their product. That's actually one thing that I think it's important to talk about. Is I think we're going to do a whole nother episode on that in the future, is liability addendums in vaccination and medicine. And vaccine manufacturers being exempt from liability is nothing new. That's standard boilerplate shit that was just added to the COVID vaccines and has been around for every vaccine you've ever taken. So there's plenty of reasons to oppose the COVID vaccination. That's not one of them. But it is a reason to oppose the pharmaceutical industrial complex as a whole, not just on COVID. But yeah, I mean, it's been a fascinating story, and people are pointing out fascinating points on it, Derek. And where do we go from here? Where do you go from here? What do you do from here while you're stuck in this kind of a holding pattern of waiting for your exemption to be processed?
Guess moving forward, the important thing is to stand firm, stand to your beliefs, fight them any way you can. The best way to do that, of course, is to not kind of engage verbally with them, but to drown them in paperwork, file IG complaints, get lawyers involved. I know right now there's a court case going around involving the DOD and natural immunity and the DOD mandate. So, I mean, you can sign affidavits with all sorts of things. I mean, you can get pretty legal with this whole process, and you can drown them in paperwork all day long. I know there will be a couple IG complaints that will be filed by myself and others over our last experience. IG complaint is Inspector General.
Yep. For those of you who weren't aware in chat. And I mean, good on you. Fight them, drown them in paperwork, bury them in discovery, as junior lawyers like to say. Make it so difficult to fight you that they eventually give up. What I'm afraid of and what I'm worried about is that nothing's actually going to get solved. Like, this is going to become a non-issue because it's going to be drawn out through the election process and election season, and the military itself is never going to address this. The military itself is never going to address standing up for the rights of its troops, fulfilling its promise to always support its troops, and the United States government is just going to ignore it until they solve it another way, where we see a change in the election demographics and a government is elected that ends all the mandates, or we see a change in, I don't know, something. It's just, I can't foresee, given the history of how the government has treated the military, as I said in my opening statement of the show, that the government is ever going to do anything to protect the military. It's one of the things that drove me away from the military. It's one of the things that's driven me away from supporting the military. It's one of the reasons why I found a sick enjoyment at county fairs of standing next to the recruiter's booth and telling kids they're being lied to and telling them not to enlist. It's one of the reasons I advocate for keeping military recruiters out of public schools and raising the enlistment age to 21, because 18-year-olds haven't experienced life and are making decisions without informed consent. And I think the military has been set up in a way to take advantage of people, to manipulate people, and to abuse people, and that our government has only grown to acknowledge that and embrace that as the status quo.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's definitely a rotten smell to all of this. You see increasingly government, military, all sorts of all parts of society are starting to be run by fiat, almost by decree. I listened to Staff Sergeant get yelled at for about half an hour, getting yelled at by a captain and a first sergeant, basically saying, "I don't care what the FDA says. I don't care what the Army regulation says. Who are you to ask for transparency? Who are you to question these orders?" Stuff like that. It's just getting ridiculous.
And that staff sergeant sounds like the kind of person I want in a leadership position in a military that I rely on for defense or for service or for response to national disaster. That staff sergeant sounds like the kind of person who's questioning the legitimacy of his orders in a manner involving rational forward thought. And like, when I joined the military and was in college while I was in the National Guard, it's at the beginning of my career that seemed to be something that was valued. And over the course of a few years, once you actually start questioning orders, there becomes a real big problem with how people view you questioning those orders.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, it's been our hour. We're a little over time. I don't mind going over time, but we're a little over time for everybody here for our scheduled hour for the radio program tomorrow. Is there anything else you want to leave people with?
Sure. I'll leave people out with my individually counseled remarks on my counseling statement here. It says, "This is not a lawful order. The FDA-approved vaccine Comirnaty is not available." And that is signed and dated on my counseling statement.
Absolutely fantastic. All right. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. Really interesting to hear it from somebody who's currently going through it and on the inside of the beast, so to speak. And again, everybody check out the TikToks. I know TikTok is a garbage platform largely, but if you look for it, the people are there. Like, there is a resistance to this within the U.S. military. And it's not just you. It's not just the people we're hearing from. It's a large outspoken group of people who are still willing to stand for their rights, who are still willing to stand for your rights, who largely, most of them enlisted because they believed in your rights, they believed in your freedom, they believed in the principles in which this country was founded, and that is what they wanted to defend, and that is what they wanted to stand for. And now that we have seen an authoritarian government abusing and using them as leverage in the push for a hegemonist control of the world, people are starting to finally wake up. And I think the best thing that you can do is to let them know that they're heard, and let them know that you support them in their mission to protect life, liberty, property, and to follow all lawful orders in the defense of the Constitution and this great nation. But until next time, everybody, you do your best to stay free. Thanks again for tuning in and joining us tonight. Make sure you hit that like button and leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts. If you haven't subscribed, go ahead and hit that big red subscribe button on YouTube and turn on notifications to get alerted every time we go live. If you enjoyed this content, you can join our production team on Patreon by following the link in the description. And don't forget to follow on social media and join our community Discord channel by following the links in the description as well. The best part of all of this is the community that we're building and growing. So go ahead and join us. And thanks once again to our awesome sponsors and patrons for making all of this possible. And if you can't catch the show live, you can always catch it the next day on YouTube, Odyssey, Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Breaker, and wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts. So until next time, everybody, be free.